might be the only time thus far in Art Speaks when an artwork is moving slowly toward one as one is talking about it. But this is a piece by the artist, American artist Robert Breer, and it was made in 1969, 1970, and it's called Osaka I. And I have a particular affinity for this work, which will become apparent as I talk about it. But basically, this piece was a prototype for 7 other domes that were identical and manufactured in 1970 for the World's Fair in Osaka in Japan. Okay, you can see how it's bumping against me. Basically, it's a 6 foot by 6 foot, it's very insistent, 6 foot by 6 foot fiberglass dome, and it is over a chassis that has small rubber wheels, and originally it was powered by car batteries. I'm going to slowly step out of its way. But basically, Breer was a super interesting artist whose father was an engineer, and in fact was an engineer for Chrysler, and essentially devised the first aerodynamic car, which was called the Chrysler Airflow. So this kind of propensity for engineering ran in the family, and Breer himself was something of a prodigy. He went to Stanford at the age of 16, and he ended up going on the GI Bill and going to Paris in the 1950s, where he fell in with a kind of crazy crowd of artists, and in particular, artists who were part of the scene of the Galerie Denis René. And what they were interested in was kinetic sculpture, i.e. sculpture that in some way moved or appeared to move. Part of this was an interest in really expanding what it meant to make an art object, what a work of art could be, and Alexander Calder is an interesting precursor to this. But Breer actually also started making animated short films at the time, stop motion films, and he was really interested in the perception of movement, whether as an image or as an object, and how that sort of was perceived by your eye. This piece is basically moving very slowly, and it's part of a series of slow-moving sculptures he started to make in the late 60s that he called floats. Sometimes he also called them creepies. But many of the original ones, or earlier ones, were much smaller, made out of styrofoam, and on tiny toy car batteries. Some of them were actually even pieces that he called rugs, which were often foil or vinyl sheets, crumpled sheets that would sort of crinkle kinetically on the floor. These floats, Breer kept making them, and he got more and more offers from engineers for more interesting and sophisticated motors. And he's part of this moment at a time when artists and engineers were also really wanting to collaborate. So then he fell in with another crazy crowd, a group called Experiments in Art and Technology, which is the group that I actually wrote my PhD dissertation on, and hence one reason I love this piece. These artists and engineers wanted to create collaborations between the two different fields. So if you're an artist interested in lasers or holograms, or let's say kinetic motors, you could be matched with an engineer who had an expertise in this field. Well, Breer ended up working with an engineer named John L. Ride. He was really interested in basically chance movement. So this is moving at about 2.5 feet per hour, and it moves about a mile per day. The other thing about it that's interesting is that if it bumps into something, as it did very insistently against me earlier, it will move away, but not in precisely the opposite direction. Breer didn't want it just to retrace its steps. He actually said it would pivot slightly because of the angle of the wheels, and therefore it might cover an entire area in any given day. Well, chance intervened with Breer as well around 1969 when he was working with this group, Experiments in Art and Technology. His next door neighbor in upstate New York also happened to be the vice president of PepsiCo. As it happens, Pepsi was creating a pavilion for the World's Fair in Osaka in 1970. And they had just come up with the new slogan, the new generation. And they wanted to basically invent youth marketing. Well, this neighbor of Breer's, when he understood what Breer was working on and who he was working with, said, oh, why don't you guys, Experiments in Art and Technology, submit a proposal for the Pepsi Pavilion? They did, and to make a very long story short, about 100 artists and engineers, many of them from Bell Laboratories, but also IBM and other companies, and then artists including Breer, Robert Whitman, David Tudor, the Japanese artist Fujiko Nakaya, and even Robert Rauschenberg and Klaus Oldenburg, to a certain extent, were involved in this project. The dome itself was an enormous 90-foot in diameter spherical mirror that created three-dimensional inverted reflections when you walked around inside, almost like inverted holograms, but even better. In the exterior, or on the exterior, there was an enormous fog sculpture created by the Japanese artist Fujiko Nakaya. And then on the platform, or the plaza in front of the pavilion, were these 7 floats by Breer, moving slowly, almost aleatorically around the plaza. The other fascinating thing about this work is that I had said that car batteries were originally used to power it. It's been continually upgraded over time, and most recently, I think by Roger Griffith in Conservation, because this was chosen by Peter Fishley and Cara Maines for this wonderful Artist Choice project. They rehabilitated this, pulled this out of storage, and now it has golf cart batteries implanted, which you don't need to plug in as often as you did the previous batteries. But what's interesting is that for those of you who are familiar with the history of the ready-made, Breer implanted a continually upgrading ready-made within this machine, so to speak, and he allowed, in fact, encouraged it to react to technological obsolescence. So in that way, it's moving both physically, but also it's changing as an object and as a machine over time. My own father was a scientist, is a physicist, and I think much of my own life I was curious about, after not doing so great in physics in college, I was really interested in the interaction between humanities and sciences. And this is just a great example of something that weds both of them, but also asks important questions about the trajectory of each and the notion of progress in both art and in science. As this is pushing me to the side, I'll just wrap up, but feel free to come up and ask any questions or interact with this afterward. Thank you.